Hi, I'm Doug Draper with Acme Distribution and the Denver Transportation Club, and I'm pleased to present our series, Supply Chain Logistics, the Storytellers. Its series is brought to you by Cap Logistics. Cap Logistics are experts offering you customized transportation solutions for every need. Please visit caplogistics.com today. So today's topic is warehousing and Colorado warehousing, and our expert guest is from Acme Distribution, Jeff Goldfogel. Jeff, thanks for coming in today.
Well, thanks for having me.
That's terrific. So before we jump into our topic, we always like to learn a little bit about our guests. So why don't you spend a couple minutes, tell us about yourself and how you got into this crazy industry, and we'll kind of start from there.
Well, it's sort of a family business kind of story. My dad was originally in the wholesale grocery business back in the 60s, and I was actually in the finance accounting world up at University of Colorado, and when I got out of that institution, I joined another one, which was the warehousing, and in those days it was the warehouse business. It wasn't so much logistics, even though it was always logistics, and got into the family business, and it's as I say, the rest is history. It was a small end type business at that time, and over the years it grew, and markets changed and a whole lot of things changed. We grew with it, and been very fortunate to have spent my entire career doing that. I've had several jobs in one industry, one company, so it's been sort of my story.
That's great. That's terrific. And I know that Acme's been around for 71 years. It's been pretty unusual in this market, so congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great. So we kind of talked a little bit before the show, kind of like Colorado warehousing realities, almost like a fireside chat that we'll do today, and really focus on what's going on here in the marketplace. So with your expertise going back, give us a picture of what warehousing kind of looked like in the 1980s, and then we'll kind of dichotomize that, if that's even the right word, of how things are looking now. So paint a picture to us of type of customers that we're working with back in the 1980s and the commodities, and also why did people pick Denver as kind of a hub with warehousing?
Back when I first got into it, which was in the mid-70s, probably the biggest driver to location decisions on the part of the manufacturing sector was tied to transportation costs. And because freight was regulated at that time, and because manufacturing was nothing close to the lean way it's done today, manufacturers, primarily food was our largest driver, tended to be located based upon ultimate customer delivery. In those days, one of the big contrasts was you had 2 or 3 days lead time, which on today's
doesn't exist.
Platform doesn't exist. Everything is if you get the order by 1 today, get it out by 5 this afternoon, and that's completely different. But so was the entire personality of the market. And so primarily food goods back in those days, large volumes, and because freight was regulated, it made sense for most of the large food people, Fortune 500s, all the way down to smaller producers. Nothing small like what we see today with so many niche specialty people in the food industry. But, Procter & Gamble's and your Unilevers and Armadillos, people of those ilks, Nestle's, they would have 14 or 15 distribution centers, and they would have 2 or 3 plants making certain products that they featured. And those could have been all around the country, but typically they were back in the manufacturing sectors of Chicago, East Coast, sometimes West Coast. So they needed to get the mix of their products into regionalized markets, and the cost of the transportation was such that having it localized and regionalized kept their costs in line, again, in a regulated transportation market. So that's sort of what drove it at the time, and Denver in those days was almost always in that mix of 12 to 14 distribution centers. Always Chicago, always California, usually eastern New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Atlanta was always big, Texas was always big. Denver, Arizona, Utah, even Kansas City to some extent, they were pretty large markets. Started to become disposable once deregulation took place in the 80s. And so that's when the major shift in what we did, what sorts of markets we appealed to, less food as the years went on, still a lot of food, but a whole different profile of what the customer needed based upon the transportation costs and the deregulated environment.
Got it. So when you say disposable, that simply means because the freight was not regulated, having the local presence wasn't needed, and it was less expensive to truck it in from a different market. Is that what you mean?
It was that, and it was also a combination of the sophistication that manufacturing. Three things actually were at play: the cost of transportation, having become deregulated, the intense volumes that the manufacturers could create because of so many LBOs and acquisitions. So Kraft buys out everybody in the world, and what they don't buy out, Unilever buys out, and so pretty soon these folks are not manufacturing just the products they used to. They are now manufacturing huge amounts, and so they no longer ship smaller amounts to all of these grocery chains. They're creating a lot of their own truckloads, and multiple truckloads, because they control so many more brands.
Right.
Concurrently, they are now producing in a much leaner fashion. So they can change their lines over. They don't have to make just product A and product B in a certain factory. They can change their lines much more easily, much more efficiently, and now all of a sudden they don't need 10 manufacturing places around the country for these massive amounts of products that they make. They can make all those things in 4. So now they have critical mass, and they have customers buying huge truckloads of their very large product offerings as compared to what used to be much smaller product offerings 20 years earlier.
Right.
So you put all that together, you got a tremendous concentration of freight, going to a decreased number of consignees because you don't have as many grocery chains as you used to have. And you now had, at that point, you were starting to see the club stores, and they're taking truckloads and truckloads and truckloads.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
And so the need to have these regional distribution centers that were actually mixing centers and break bulks of sort for the grocery industry sort of evaporated. And markets like Denver became very good markets for other things, but no longer that critical market for the grocery houses.
Yeah. People are so brand loyal that you may not realize a truck driving the road has 15 different brands in it, but it's all owned by the same company.
Exactly.
And so why have a handful of pallets of this product and that product to ship it in? Did you notice with the diversification that the warehouse industry in Denver contracted? Are there less warehouse providers here in Colorado than there were in the 80s?
You know, I don't have statistics to support that, but what seemed to have happened was the prominent warehouse distribution groups grew, and there were always a lot of niche operators. And then in our case, actually Acme, which is, as you pointed out earlier, a 71-year-old company, acquired my companies back in the late 80s, and then we merged at that point. So we took 2 real large operations by Denver standards. Large by Denver standards is very different than large by LA standards or New Jersey standards, and created a pretty large presence, which of course created opportunities for other smaller operators to fill the niches that we either couldn't or didn't fill well. And so there, I think, again, the landscape has changed, but in terms of the number of players, there seem to be a lot of small niche players that can really fill some pretty specific needs. And of course, the needs in the market shift radically with technology, for one thing. Pick and pack, B2C, a lot of things that B2C meant nothing in 1980. We didn't know what a B2C was. Right? And so whether the larger operations adapt to that, again, a B2C provider in Denver, Colorado looks very different than a B2C provider in Los Angeles or perhaps in Louisville, Kentucky or Atlanta. Right. And so those things shift and those ebb and flow, I think, a lot, and the people in markets kind of find their niche, and we don't pretend to serve them all. Sometimes we think we probably serve more than we should, trying to stay focused on what we do well. Gotcha. So really, we kind of roll into what things look like nowadays, and I think we've touched a little bit on it in the sense that a warehouse full of 1,000 pallets of beans has really been replaced with an agile market, and people can come to market quicker, where your warehouse may be filled with hundreds of customers, where in the 1980s it may be 10 or 20. Is that kind of what you're saying? Yeah, I think the old 80-20 rule probably applies in a different fashion. The overriding preponderance of the volume back again in the 70s and 80s was, as you say, large grocery manufacturing. And when that sort of gave way to this deregulated environment and the realities of that, our product mix, we're much more diversified than we were. And that's both a good thing and a bad thing, because trying to be that many things to so many different industries is a challenge. It's a challenge from a technology point of view. It's a challenge from an economic point of view to provide services at a price that this market will accept. And the value add becomes nebulous from time to time. High value goods versus low value goods. Lead times are significantly less than what they were in the past, and that's just reality.
Yeah.
And yet, as we'll talk about on local markets, some of the challenges labor-wise, space-wise, I don't think Denver's unique in that regard, but the growth out here and the quality of life, I think, has really driven those indicators more rapidly than other markets. So in some ways, we compete locally and regionally with other good providers in the area, but we sometimes think we compete more with other markets where perhaps labor's a little lower. And since freight is deregulated, there's a tipping point where a manufacturer may say, gosh, I really like being in Denver, but the cost of space, the cost of labor, which results in the cost of services, to the point where maybe I can move 500-600 miles away, and even though there will be a freight penalty, if this labor differential and space differential is large enough, the freight differential may not be a problem.
Yeah, so you're not dealing with assets and a whole other entity.
And another, maybe you can combine inventory. So if you're currently in Dallas and Denver, and the cost in Dallas is significantly lower than the cost in Denver, well, maybe at that point you say, hey, I can save an inventory, put all of it in Dallas, and pay a penalty on the freight, but save an inventory and have some incrementally lower costs on a transactional basis.
Yeah, for sure. So warehousing, obviously, there is some real estate. It's a real estate play, and without going into we'll talk about the elephant in the room, so to speak, with legalization and the cannabis industry and kind of the unintended consequences. What I've gathered, working in the industry, is rent is super high. It's expensive, and a rising tide raises all ships. So whenever the legalization came around a couple years ago, what did you see with the market rates and the market conditions of non-cannabis related industries?
I think it was a perfect storm in many regards, and it's low-hanging fruit to focus on the cannabis impact because it's accurate and it's factual. But in my opinion, and again, I'm not a real estate professional, but we were coming out of a time when there was a little bit of a glut of real estate.
Mm-hmm.
So there wasn't as much new product coming out of the ground as there might otherwise have been if the market had been more vibrant. And here comes legalized marijuana, and there becomes a frenzy to get space and get warehouse space. And of course, the amount of money that these folks had to put into finishing the space made the cost of the space almost insignificant. So rates that would have been appropriate before that happened became much, much more inflated, and the economy had gotten better in general, so the amount of inventory available was starting to get swallowed up even without that. But that was a huge catalyst, and man, it drove prices crazy. Availability went down. I sometimes muse at the fact that landlords who had taken a very serious beating for a lot of years finally kind of had their day in court.
Yeah.
And some of them I know right now are feeling the effects of the instability of the marijuana industry between some of the regulations and some of the political likes and dislikes. It hasn't been quite the feeding frenzy now that it was then.
Right.
And some of the players that weren't really stable players in the early stages have gone away. And so it's sort of a roller coaster on the real estate side. As far as the labor side, huge impact.
Right.
It takes a tremendous amount of jobs, takes a tremendous amount of labor, entry-level type to maybe slightly over entry-level folks. And if they can work for entry-level money and work in a 420 shop,
Right.
compared to coming and driving a forklift and dragging cases where you're not allowed to have 420 involvement, at least not that we're supposed to allow. Pretty easy choice.
Yeah.
Why would you go drive a forklift and drag heavy boxes for X dollars an hour when for similar money, maybe even a little bit less, you work around that, you get tips, you probably get samples. I don't work in one of those shops, so I'll just surmise that.
Right.
But so it did put a lot of pressure on on the labor force, and it also puts labor pressure rather on hiring practices. Certainly, drivers are heavily regulated under the DOT.
Right.
Other jobs are not. So imagine the complexities of if we are compelled, and appropriately so, to drug test drivers. Do we have a policy that drug tests everybody else? And if it's not everybody else, is it forklift operators? Well, you're not legally required to, but as a practical matter, if you do that, what does that do to your supply of labor? If you don't do that, what does that do to your supply of labor? And if you opt out of doing that, what does that do to the overall workforce? Talk about morale, talk about safety, talk about practicality. And it has put a lot of pressure on the HR side of our business.
I can imagine. Yeah, we had talked before that driving a forklift and moving boxes in the 80s, that was a career. Right? You come in and you could support your family and make a good living, and now it's almost a job.
And it's not even a great job. We like to think of it as a great place to work, but we muse sometimes. In the early days of my career, I would look at employment applications, and I would see people that had been someplace 4 years and then somewhere else for 5 years, and I'd look at that and I go, man, this guy can't keep a job. And which at that time was probably somewhat accurate. Today, when you look at an application, especially for not even entry level, but even slightly beyond entry level, if they've been anywhere more than a year or two before jumping somewhere else, that's almost as odd as the opposite of that was years and years ago. And that's a huge adjustment for somebody my age. I've had one job in my life, and by the way, that's no great honor. Right. Probably not as versatile as maybe if I were going out to look for one today, they'd look at my app and go, this guy's a little narrow. Yeah. But certainly the application today looks nothing like what it looked in, and that's largely because it isn't a career. Back in the earlier days of my career, people were coming back from Vietnam. They may have had a high school education. They may have had young families or were starting young families, and they needed a job, and we were a pretty good employer, as were a lot of the other folks. Provided health care, provided some retirement, and they have pretty good careers, and they'd stay a long time, and which made the whole training thing very different. Today it's much, much different. Turnovers unprecedented, at least in our industry, and we have to deal with it. Yeah, it's a tough gig. Like you said, flipping burgers on a defined 8 to 5 is a lot easier than having the skill, the knowledge, and the safety factor of driving a forklift in a building with moving equipment. Absolutely. And I'm living testament to that. When I started my career 25 years ago, absolutely, if you didn't have your job for more than a couple years, you were damaged goods. Something's wrong with this person. We shouldn't hire him. And now, like you said, it's almost the opposite. Yeah. It's we do some pre-employment testing sometimes, and when we've lost what seems like a disproportionately large number of candidates after a short-term employment stint, we'll look back at the tests and we'll say, "Wow, what is our criteria for the test?" It's subjective to the extent that not everybody scores at the top level. So we have base levels to say, this person's been a great operator for us. Let's kind of try to get a profile that fits somewhat to that. And when you look at some of the people we've hired, you say, I don't know, how close was that really? And then you say, well, if you get too picky, who are you going to put on the forklifts? Right. And then we talked a little bit about kind of the Amazons and the pressures that those folks put on the hiring and the supply of labor. And you'll learn a lot from them. We're learning a lot from them. They're highly technologically driven. They can train more easily. They can replace more easily. Yeah, that's a key one right there. Yeah. And we customize with 400 or 500 different customers. It's a tough balance. How much money can you spend training at the risk of losing folks quickly? So pre-screening, getting the people that really have a high probability for success is where our real focus is right now. And it's not simple, because the field from which you're finding those folks isn't rich. And yet if you don't do that and find that, the revolving door becomes horrible. You're stuck in a catch-22. Well, why don't we train them better? Well, hell, spend all the money training them better. In the last 3 days, Well, why don't you screen them better? Well, you come screen them. Where are you going to find them?
Right.
So it becomes this sort of vicious circle.
Yeah, for sure. So it's, and we've kind of gone into our next topic of, what do things look like in the future? Because we spoke about 1980s, thousands of pallets, one or two clients, the speed to market, the requirement, the Amazon effect, as people refer to, expensive in Denver for lots of variables, tough labor market, all those things, like you said, that is a perfect storm as well. Taking all into consideration, kind of what do you think is going to be happening in 2019, and maybe even a bigger question, what do you think the warehousing industry is going to look like specifically here in Denver in the future?
I think it'll continue to change into a higher level of value add. There will always be a certain amount of commodity business. I'm not at all pessimistic about the Denver market, and I'm not as concerned about the other neighboring distribution cities, though certainly cognizant and aware of them, because costs throughout the country in today's economy are all going up. I think I don't know if I'd say my years of stupidity, but my years of being around it, it's going to be cyclical. I'm seeing the labor market. It's like the real estate market for homes. It isn't that homes are not still going for a lot of money compared to what they did years ago, but the feeding frenzy has softened up a little bit, and people have asked way more for their homes than they ever would have before, and even when they were doing that a year ago, everybody's overbidding those. That seems to be softening up, and I see the same thing happening in the commercial real estate side. There's a fair amount of stuff coming out of the ground. Pretty good absorption. It isn't like there's not a lot of glut, but over the next 3 to 5 years, or next couple of years, I see that leveling off a little bit. I also see the cost of doing business creating a demand on businesses like ours to do things better, do things smarter. We always say we don't want to be on the bleeding edge of technology, and sometimes we want to be as close to the leading edge as we can afford, and as the quality of what we provide can be compensated for. We sometimes say to great customers, "Can you afford zero defects?" Some can, some can't, and the notion that you can provide zero defects with no cost is clearly not true. So I see us getting more sophisticated, not necessarily just technologically, but in terms of how we find people, how we compensate people, how we motivate people, and how we provide the services to our customers that really fit the bill and that aren't more than they need and aren't less than they need. So I'm very optimistic that we'll just get better, and I think the Amazons of the world make you get better.
Yeah.
Both because they change the mode and method of doing business, and there's such an impact on how the market sees service. So,
yeah, it's very, very interesting. So on the really in any business, you got the real estate play and you got the human aspect of it. But whether you're a lawyer, a pot shop, flipping burgers, it's really all about the people and trying to find the right ones. And with the Amazon effect and the fast turn of this industry and the fulfillment, it boils down to people.
Yeah, and in that sense, we're in the middle of kind of an interesting cultural shift at our organization. I suspect it's true in a lot. Is that I'm really focused on trying to create an environment that differentiates us as a place to work, as a great place to work for the demographic of the people that we're trying to get to come to work for us. It's not what it was. Again, it's not career people. It doesn't mean they're not great people. It doesn't mean they can't be great people. But if we're going to continue to appeal to the workforce in the same way we did 30 years ago, the likelihood of us being a provider of choice or a job of choice not going to be there. So we're putting in some amenities, and the fun behind that is some of the older folks, and I don't mean chronologically older, but certainly tenured people are fighting that a little bit. And it's been an interesting clash of the titans, but we're going to pursue.
Yeah.
We're going to pursue.
Well, like everything, there is a season, right?
There is a season.
Everything, and definitely the season in the warehouse logistics business here in Colorado is changing. So.
Yeah, it is. And that labor thing is huge, and the space thing is huge, and you get better. You get better because the market makes you get better, and if you're a good organization and you've had longevity and success and you're willing to continue to confront the challenges, you get better.
Yeah. Well, 71 years or better, I'm sure that Acme will find the right way to ebb and flow in this market. So
We hope so.
hey, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining us today, and I think our audience learned a little bit about the ins and the outs of the warehousing business here in Colorado.
Thanks
So,
for having me.
again,
Delighted to be here.
Thank you very much. So thank you for joining us today on the Connect and Collaborate Network featuring supply chain logistics, the Storytellers. We've had a great storyteller here today. So thanks again, Jeff.
Thank you.